August 28, 2017. A man came to pick up 14-year-old Charlotte for swim practice at her place. The two-story yellow house was very quiet when he knocked, and no one answered the door. He looked through a small window and saw Charlotte's mom, Michele, standing still on the stairs. Michele had set Charlotte ready to be picked up, but for some reason, she wasn't moving at all. Feeling something was wrong, the man called 911 and said that Michele hadn't moved and Charlotte was nowhere to be found. Getting the call, Sergeant John McDivitt came and went inside the house, and no one expected what he discovered there. Michele Neurauter wasn't just standing there. She was hanging from the stair railing with a rope around her neck. She had no pulse and it first seemed like a suicide. But this wasn't the first time police had been called to the house. They had come many times before over the last 2 years because of fights between Michele and one of her daughters, Carrie. This time, something didn't seem right. There were strange marks on Michele's body, and in her bedroom, the bed looked like it had been moved, suggesting there had been a struggle. These clues made the investigators suspicious, and they started to think something gruesome had happened to Michele. But what really happened to her? Is it a murder or any deep conspiracy? And most importantly, who killed her and what for? Michele Neurauter was living in upstate New York and had been divorced from her husband, Lloyd, for a while. They were still tangled up in a custody battle over their youngest daughter, Charlotte, who was the only one of their 3 daughters still a minor at the time. Now, looking back, you'd think things were great between Michele and Lloyd. They met in high school back in 1989, started dating, and got married just 2 years after they graduated. They both went on to earn their degrees, Lloyd in engineering and Michele in literature. They settled down in this small town called Corning, where Lloyd landed a job at Corning Glass, a big-time Fortune 500 company, while Michele stayed home to raise their 3 daughters. At first glance, they looked like the perfect family, with friends describing Lloyd as super charming and attentive, and Michele seeming really happy. But as time went on, the reality started to crumble. One of their daughter's friends later opened up about how strict and controlling Lloyd was. He had this crazy idea of discipline where he wouldn't think twice about slapping his daughters if they messed up, even in front of others. He'd make them kneel facing the wall as punishment. And then there was this whole other side to him. He'd take their middle daughter, Carrie, to ballet class and use it as a chance to hit on the other moms. It seemed harmless back then, and the girls had a decent relationship with him despite his strictness. But nobody really knew what was going on behind closed doors. Things took a turn in late 2007 when Michele stopped talking to her parents. Her mom, Jeannie, was totally shocked. There wasn't any big fight. She just suddenly cut them off. Jeannie suspected it was all because of Lloyd, thinking he might have threatened Michele or the kids to keep her quiet. It felt like he was trying to isolate her from her family, which is just so sad. Then in 2008, the financial crisis hit, and everything changed. Lloyd got laid off from his job and couldn't find work nearby, so he ended up moving to New Jersey for a new gig. That actually gave Michele some breathing room, and her friends noticed she seemed a lot more relaxed without him around. She even got a job as an English teacher at a local college. But even though Lloyd wasn't there physically, his shadow still loomed large over her life. It was a tough situation all around. But to everyone's surprise, Lloyd suddenly dropped the bomb and filed for divorce. He's stuck with child support payments he really didn't want to deal with. At this point, their oldest daughter had moved in with him in New Jersey, while Michele had set up shop in a new house in Corning with their 2 younger girls. But Lloyd was trying to get full custody of Carrie and Charlotte as well. Maybe he thought it would help him dodge those child support payments, or he just wanted to make sure Michele wouldn't have custody. Since then, everything started getting wild. He threw in a whopping 26 post-divorce filings. In those filings, Lloyd accused Michele of all sorts of things to make her look like an unfit mom. Of course, Michele wasn't just going to take that lying down. She started gathering evidence against him, saying he was trying to turn the girls against her. But how everything led to that fateful day, and what really happened to her. We will come to this point later. First, we will take a look at the investigation, because that will reveal what a shocking conspiracy that Michele became a victim of. And even before that, just make sure to subscribe to this channel to know about more chilling true crime cases like this. Right from the get-go, the cops were skeptical about it being a suicide. When Sergeant McDivitt found her dead, the whole team started digging in to figure out if it was really suicide or something much darker. They noticed some pretty suspicious stuff right away. For starters, there were these weird ligature marks on her chin, almost like someone had come up behind her and pulled a robe around her neck. It didn't seem likely she'd do that to herself. Plus, there were scratch marks on her neck too, which could mean she was fighting someone off while they were trying to choke her. As per statistics, women don't typically go for hanging as a way to commit suicide. They usually pick less violent methods, and then there were odd things in the house, especially in Michelle's room. Her bed was pushed away from the headboard, and there were smudges of her blood on the wall. One of the first things they needed to do was find the youngest girl since she was supposed to be home. They tried to get in touch with Lloyd, but no luck there. Eventually, they got a call from Carrie, who was absolutely beside herself. A family friend had reached out to tell her their mom was dead. She let the officer know that she had her little sister with her at her place in Rochester, which is about 100 miles away. Carrie then explained how Charlotte, who was meant to be in Corning with Michelle, ended up with her instead. Carrie had just moved into this new apartment because she was heading to the Rochester Institute of Technology. One Saturday, on August 26th, she drove back home for one last family night. Little did she know that 2 days later, Michelle would be found dead. When Carrie got to the house, her mom just blew up at her, accusing her of taking her dad's side in this nasty custody battle over her little sister Charlotte. Things escalated fast, so Carrie thought it best to grab Charlotte and get out of there before the whole situation blew up even more. Now, arguments like this were pretty common in their house. The cops had shown up to their place before when things got too heated. There was this one time about 2 years ago when Michelle and Carrie had a big fight that spilled out into the driveway. Carrie stood in front of Michelle's car, not letting her leave. Michelle claimed she was just slowly inching forward to get Carrie to move, but Carrie insisted her mom was trying to run her over. The cops got involved, but nothing really came of it. Given all that drama, it's no wonder Carrie wanted to leave with Charlotte. If Michelle really did try to run her over, Carrie had every right to be worried about both of their safety. Carrie said she was only in the house for about 15 minutes before she took Charlotte and headed back to Rochester. Charlotte also backed this up, saying she was sleeping on the couch when all the yelling woke her up, and then Carrie got her, and they took off. Then on Monday, August 28th, Lloyd, Carrie's dad, called the police to let them know he was flying back from a job interview in California. He said he hadn't talked to Michelle all weekend, but he didn't seem shocked at all when he heard she'd apparently killed herself. Less than 6 hours after hearing the news, he was at the courthouse canceling his child support payments. With Michelle gone, he figured there was no point in keeping those payments going. The investigators caught Lloyd at the courthouse and decided to have a little chat with him in their car. During the interrogation, he painted Michelle as a total mess. He claimed she was super manic and always angry. He even mentioned that back in the day she was part of a suicide pact with her friends. Lloyd went on to tell them how Michelle would scream at their daughters from upstairs and then slam her bedroom door so hard she actually broke the doorframe. At that point, the cops were still trying to piece everything together. They were waiting on the time of death and the autopsy report to see what really went down. After chatting with Lloyd, it seemed like suicide might be a likely reason, but they weren't ready to shut any doors just yet. When the autopsy report came in, it confirmed she died from asphyxiation, but the manner of death was a total mystery. There just wasn't enough evidence to say whether it was a homicide or a suicide, which was a huge headache for the investigators. So, the investigators started digging deeper, trying to find out who might have had a reason to want her gone. Turns out, both Carrie and Lloyd had some possible motives. Carrie and her mom often clashed, so there was a chance an argument could have escalated into something deadly. Then there was Lloyd. He was sitting on a mountain of credit card debt, like $100,000 worth, and he had to pay around $6,000 a month in child support. Plus, Michelle had this life insurance policy that would pay out $250,000 to their daughter, who was still a minor. And since Lloyd was her legal guardian, he could get his hands on that cash. All of this made it seem like there was motive for murder, but the kicker was that Lloyd claimed he was in California when Michelle died. At least that's what the investigators thought at first. Then they got the time of death. And surprisingly, Lloyd wasn't in California or even New Jersey that time. He was actually in Rochester, New York, just 100 miles away from where Michele passed. As the investigators dug into Michelle's last days, they started to see a different picture than what Carrie and Lloyd were painting. Just days before her death, Michele showed up in court to fight Lloyd's bid for sole custody of their daughter. And for the first time in this whole legal mess, Lloyd didn't even bother to show up. He didn't withdraw or ask for a delay. He just ghosted the whole thing, so the case got delayed, which was a big win for Michele. But that wasn't all. Her friends said she was doing really well. She loved being an English professor, had her faith, and was surrounded by supportive friends. It just seemed like she was in a good spot, which made everything even more complicated. Now let's get back to the day Michele died. She was out having a blast with her youngest kid and another family, sliding down this grassy hill on huge blocks of ice. They've got all these pictures and videos from the day, and Michele looked super happy, not like someone who's suicidal. So the investigators figured Michele likely died on a Saturday, and they started looking at Lloyd's story again. He said he drove up from New Jersey to help Carrie move that day, then checked into a hotel. The next morning, Carrie and her sister Charlotte came by for breakfast, and then Lloyd took off to New Jersey to catch a flight to California for a job interview. To verify his story, the investigators talked to Carrie, and her account matched Lloyd's perfectly. She said he walked her to her car, and then she headed to Corning to spend the night at home. But as we mentioned earlier, things took a weird turn when she said her mom freaked out, so she grabbed her little sister Charlotte and left. At first, it looked like Lloyd's alibi was solid. His phone records showed he hadn't left the hotel that night. But this made Carrie the more likely suspect since she was in Corning, even though she claimed she was only there for about 15 minutes. Not nearly enough time to do anything to Michele. But when they checked Carrie's phone, it turned out she was in Corning for a whole 2 hours, not just 15 minutes. That didn't look good for her. She seemed to be lying. Still, the investigators weren't quite ready to dismiss Lloyd. Next, they looked at the security footage from the Microtel Inn where Lloyd was staying. The cameras caught him checking in and later heading to his room. Then there's footage of Carrie visiting him that evening, and both of them leaving the hotel together. But according to their stories, Lloyd walked her out and then went back to his room. However, the grainy parking lot footage showed them leaving in her car together. Lloyd didn't come back until 6:30 the next morning, still in the same clothes he wore the day before. An hour later, Carrie and Charlotte showed up for breakfast with him. So, things were definitely not adding up, and the investigators had a lot to piece together. The cops figured Carrie was just covering for her dad, but all they had were circumstantial evidence, so they decided to tap both of their phones. They were hoping to catch a smoking gun moment, but 2 months had gone by since the murder, and neither of them was spilling any secrets over the phone. So, to shake things up a bit, the investigators decided to focus on Carrie first, thinking she might crack under pressure. One of them called her up, asking if she could come in for some routine questions. Carrie was like, "Sure, I'll be there on Monday." But as soon as she hung up, she called her dad and spilled the beans. Lloyd advised her not to talk to the police and suggested she lie by saying she had a counseling appointment. He even joked about her pretending to cry because it was a tough situation for her. Carrie agreed, thinking it was a good idea. Now, while that wasn't exactly a confession, it showed the cops they were onto something. With this new lead, the district attorney, Brooks Baker, decided to bring in a private forensic pathologist to take a fresh look at how Michele died. Even though Michele had been cremated at Lloyd's request, the pathologist dug through all the old autopsy notes and photos. He noticed something weird about a mark on Michele's chin and some bruising in her eyes, which led him to conclude it was definitely a homicide. They were getting closer to having enough evidence for a trial, but they still needed the full scoop and a confession. So, on January 24, 2018, 2 state troopers showed up in Syracuse, New York, where Carrie was doing her internship. At the same time, 2 investigators headed over to Lloyd's office in New Jersey. They confronted him, saying that his ex-wife's death was ruled a homicide, and asked him if he was in Corning that night. But Lloyd denied everything. When they asked him about taking a lie detector test, he jumped at the chance and agreed right away. Meanwhile, Carrie wasn't handling the pressure as well. After the cops laid it on thick, she broke down and confessed that she had driven her dad down to Corning the night her mom was killed. Recorded at a police station with cameras rolling, Carrie finally explained exactly what had happened. It all started about a week before her mom, Michele, was murdered. Carrie's dad, Lloyd, came to her all frantic, saying he was at rock bottom. He had this huge debt hanging over his head and couldn't support Michele anymore. He manipulated Carrie by telling her he was thinking about taking his own life. But then he hit her with this crazy idea. If she helped him kill Michele, he could stick around. It was like either her dad was going to off himself or her mom would be dead. Apparently, this might look sudden, but Lloyd had been playing mind games with Carrie for years, setting everything up so she'd feel backed into a corner. He'd been pitting her against Michele, kind of grooming her for this moment. There were even court papers from their custody battle where Michele called Lloyd out for parental alienation. Basically, that means he was tearing down Michele in front of the kids, trying to twist Carrie's view of her mom. So after Carrie agreed to help her dad, he laid out his evil plan. He was going to shove a towel in Michele's mouth to quiet her down, choke her with some rope, and then make it look like a suicide. On the day of the murder, they left their motel in Rochester and headed to Corning. Carrie said she let Lloyd into the house while Michele was upstairs. The moment Lloyd walked in, Michele started freaking out, yelling at him. Carrie just stayed downstairs while the shouting got louder, waking up her little sister, Charlotte, who was sleeping on the couch. Carrie took Charlotte outside and waited in the car, leaving the hatchback open so Lloyd could sneak in whenever he was done. And that's exactly what he did. After he murdered Michele and staged everything, he came back and got into the car. Carrie shut the hatch and drove back to Rochester like nothing happened. The whole thing matched up perfectly with the hotel security footage and Carrie's phone records. Turns out she'd actually been missing for 2 hours instead of the 15 minutes she first claimed. And when they got Carrie to confess on tape, the police had enough to go after Lloyd. But surprisingly, he ghosted on the polygraph test. The authorities were still tracking his phone, and it led them to this parking garage in Princeton, New Jersey. When the cops got there, they found Lloyd chilling on the top level of the 5-story garage. Before they could grab him, he hopped onto the ledge and threatened to jump. For over 2 hours, he kept the police at bay, saying he'd end it all, but eventually, he stepped back from the edge. Because just when he thought he was in the clear, he made a huge mistake. He turned his back on a state trooper who took that chance to tackle him. So there was Lloyd, 45 years old, in handcuffs for the murder of his ex-wife, Michele. But even though they had him, getting a conviction wasn't a sure thing. Carrie's confession was the strongest piece of evidence, but the district attorney was worried that having her dad around in court might throw her off. To build a stronger case, they offered Carrie a plea deal. If she pled guilty and testified against Lloyd, she could get her sentence cut down from 25 years to life to just 15 years to life. Meanwhile, they were also checking Michele's clothes for Lloyd's DNA. After a few weeks behind bars, Carrie finally agreed to testify. But when she went over her story with the prosecutors again, things took a twist. She confessed that she also helped Lloyd stage everything after Michele was dead. Apparently, they moved Michele's body from the bedroom to the banister and tossed her over after Lloyd tied a rope. That was a huge shocker. It became clear that Lloyd's defense would be to pin everything on Carrie. The DA then looked into the idea that Lloyd had been manipulating his daughter for years to kill Michele and also take the fall for it. So they approached Lloyd with a deal. If he pled guilty to first-degree murder and admitted what he did, he'd get 25 years to life, maybe even life without parole. Surprisingly, he took the deal. In court, he first said he killed Michele because he was scared she'd hurt their daughters, but then he eventually revealed the planning of the whole murder. When it was time for sentencing, Lloyd got life sentence without parole. Carrie's fate turned out a bit differently. Instead of at least 15 years, the DA agreed to a lighter sentence. She ended up with just 1 to 3 years and got released in January 2020. Some people thought that was too lenient for her part in her mom's death. But Michele's mother, Carrie's grandmother didn't see it that way. She believed Michele would have wanted Carrie to get the help she needed to rebuild her life and be happy. Carrie's journey to recovery is going to be a tough one, no doubt. As for Lloyd, his path has come to a dead end. He tried to dodge his money problems but ended up committing a cold-blooded murder, trapping himself in a life sentence he can never escape. What do you think about it? Did Carrie deserve a more intense punishment, or do you think a lighter punishment would give her a chance to make a better future? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to know how far this practice of manipulation, attention-seeking, and insecurities can go, this case would give you chills with a dark mix of disappearance, murder, and witchcraft. For more chilling true crime cases like this, don't forget subscribe to the channel and leave a like for this video. See you soon.